The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Skepticism and the Historical Jesus. So last night I moderated the debate between Bart Ehrman and Bob Price on Did Jesus Exist? And this isn't intended to be a comprehensive or critical debate review. I post reviews of my own debates, but I don't post reviews of other people's debates because I'm unfortunately not the Lord High Emperor of what makes for a good debate. I don't get to decide how everybody else argues. But I want to talk a little bit about the debates, give my thoughts on the topic in general, where I was before the debate, during the debate, and after the debate, along with a couple of specific things that happen that might give you an insight if you're having conversations like this as well. Before the debate began, I was really close to dead middle, not dead mythicist. Did Jesus actually exist as a historical character, or is he a fictional myth under whatever explanation that mythicists offer? I was not committed very much either way, although I probably leaned a little bit towards historicity, because that's where the bulk of the scholarship is, but I was really hoping that the debate would give me information, would challenge my beliefs on certain things, and help me kind of figure out where should I be? Am I going to move at all, or am I going to stay stuck here in the middle? I'd known Bob Price, and we'd interacted off and on over the years, and originally I was a little concerned that I might favor him because I hadn't actually met Bart Ehrman, but I met Bart right before we went up on stage, and we chatted. And my goal was to be the moderator for the debate that I would want at my debates as a moderator, and I knew that I would fail, and then I would have more empathy for moderators at my debate. It's difficult, especially during the Q&A period. I was familiar with both of their work, and while I probably leaned a little towards historical, I wasn't committed. It's worth pointing out, though, for those who aren't familiar with mythicism, that it's the position that Jesus, as well as other religious figures, didn't actually exist, but are mythical figures. I've spoken before about how there are at least two different kind of camps of mythicists. One is a seemingly unscholarly, off-the-grid, conspiracy theorist-minded mythicist version that has even gone to claim that Christianity was invented in the 4th century by the Pope and the Masons, and they don't bother to realize how did we get a Pope if we didn't have Christianity of some type already existing. The other mythicist camp is a lot more scholarly, that investigates and tries to apply skepticism and critical thinking to religious claims, which we should all do. The question is it okay to question whether or not a person actually existed? Well, of course it is. Is that the way we normally do things? No. Some of the mythicists get into astrotheology, this idea of sun god, the stuff that showed up in the first part of Zeitgeist, which they've revised because the first version of the first part of Zeitgeist was crap, and now it's just not quite as crappy. The comparing of the Jesus story to other myths as a way of saying, clearly this is a myth too, just doesn't cut it. That's not a sound argument. You can say that we now have good reason to perhaps investigate further, but you can't conclude that just because this story has certain elements and this other story has certain elements, that one story was copied from the other or merely copied from the other. One of the things that we know is that we're human beings trying to solve similar problems and answer similar questions with similar brains and backgrounds. So it's hardly surprising that we would invent similar stories. Now, my view is that even if Jesus did, in fact, exist, the miracle stories and the things surrounding his life that aren't believable aren't believable. I know that's a tautology, but we're going to have to deal with it for the moment because we have no good reason to think that those things occurred, but that doesn't mean that just because somebody was reportedly a miracle worker, that if we don't have good reason to believe the miracles, that we also don't have good reason to believe the person existed. If you need an example, George Washington did not tell a lie about chopping down the cherry tree. That's a fiction that's adopted to somebody that we generally recognize as historical. I don't know that it would occur to anybody to say, hey, let's go investigate and find out if there was a historical George Washington. Things are a little different when we start digging back further in time in the 1st century. So I pointed out beforehand, I wanted them both to be comfortable that I was going to be moderating, that I might have some questions, and that I would try to be as fair as I could for both of them. Neither mythicist camp, neither the ones that like have a full-on tinfoil hat with a beanie, or the ones that might just have a little piece of tin they haven't removed from the former hat. Neither of them are taken seriously by modern scholars. And this bugs me. It bugs me because I want to know what the justification is for not taking it seriously. It may well be justified for the same reason that we don't pay too much attention to the flat earthers, even though they're currently going, crazy on putting out videos, and they're getting flashier, and they've got celebrities that are, oh, the Earth's flat, I've proved you all wrong. And I'm just like, what world have I woken up in? So when I was sitting there for the debate, Dr. Ehrman spoke first. He was defending the idea that Jesus actually existed historically. He presented a mixed defense by kind of preemptively arguing against some mythicist claims that he'd heard before, and also offering arguments for his position. In the past, Dr. Richard Carrier had exposed fallacies in Ehrman's book that showed problems with his arguments and wrote it all up, and I thought it was great, because even though I agreed with, or kind of agreed with Ehrman that it was a historical, that there was a historical Jesus, if your arguments are bad, your arguments are bad. I hate bad arguments. I hate them most when they're coming from people who are defending positions I hold. I don't mind so much if the other side has them. I can then use those to exploit during the debate. And that's why on occasion I'm even harder on my atheist, humanist, skeptic friends if they make a bad argument. Because I want our side to have good arguments. If we don't, we're wrong. We shouldn't be doing what we're doing. But we're not wrong. You can rest easy. But I listened to Ehrman's presentation from that debate, and I didn't hear any obvious flaws. Now, partly I was sitting on stage, so I couldn't hear everything. The sound was directed out at the audience. But I didn't spot anything that was incredibly problematic. And he made a couple of really good points that I hadn't heard expressed the way he expressed them that evening. One of the contentions is that there's a passage where Paul is writing, and he talks about going to meet Peter and James, the brother of the Lord. And there's a lot of questions about what does that mean? What does brother mean? Does it mean like he's one of my Christian brothers, or an actual relative of the family? And the one thing that Ehrman pointed out is he wrote to say that he met Peter and the brother of the Lord. They are clearly both Christian brothers. He's specifically identifying James with the brother. Otherwise, you'd say, I met with my brothers, or the brothers of the Lord, Peter and James. But when you say Peter and James, the brother of the Lord, now it seems very strongly that you're talking about an actual familial relationship. And I thought that was one of the good points that he made. Dr. Price spoke second. He defended the mythicist position. And it's a little difficult to address his arguments, as it was a little difficult to hear. But I didn't find it to be a particularly strong defense of mythicism so much as it was a pretty good introduction to mythicism and this parade of verse, source, verse, source, and he put it together pretty well, where it was, if we were to find out that we have no good reason to believe that Superman existed, what could we then say about Clark Kent? Did Clark Kent actually exist, or was he a fictional being? Framing it that way, it gave a different look at the mythicist positions, or I should say one of the mythicist positions. There were the other thing that he did was that he didn't say, this is truth. Instead, he acknowledged that the mythicist position is supposition, speculation, and that he's just explaining what he personally finds compelling and doesn't really care what other people believe. Well, I do. I care what people believe because it informs their actions, and their actions have consequences for them and all of us. I care because I'd rather live in a world where people have sound, rational beliefs than not, even if they're on trivial things. Sorry, your lucky socks probably aren't lucky. Am I going to spend a whole lot of time arguing with you about that? No, because there are bigger fish to fry. But if you actually sit down and want to talk to me and try to demonstrate that your lucky socks are lucky, we can do that. And I have no problem having conversations and arguments like that, as people who have seen the show can attest to. There were a lot of Bible verses mentioned by both, and some were just loosely referenced and not actually read, which I'm sure was frustrating for people who don't know what those verses say, the Christians in the audience. Sorry, that's unavoidable. There were plenty of atheists who had no idea what those verses said either. There were also many points of agreement during the debate, which I like, but the disagreements were a little problematic on a couple of occasions. Bob Price had said that he doesn't think that any of the writings attributed to Paul were actually written by Paul. Now, Ehrman had already pointed out that of the, 16 or 17 letters attributed to Paul, like 6 or 7 of them are generally accepted, not written by Paul, and perhaps by 3 different authors. But modern scholarship holds that the rest of them were likely written by Paul. And so when Bob Price said that he didn't believe that any of them were written by Paul, Ehrman laughed. And Bob got irritated and said something along the lines of, well, if I'm just here to have my views ridiculed, and then set the mic down. Now, that was a mistake on both their parts. It's hard not to laugh sometimes when you're faced with something that you think is ridiculous. It's almost involuntary. But also how you respond to that is important in a debate. We're having these conversations, and I'm not just necessarily talking about a public formal debate. Most of you aren't going to do that. But the same thing happens in conversations with family members and coworkers, and it's hard to fight that urge. One of the most common questions I get, I've got it twice today already, is, wow, how do you have the patience to do that over and over and over again? How can you sit there and not just, lose it? Well, on occasion I do. But the answer is I give a damn. I actually care about how I'm represented, how the show's represented, how atheism is represented. And I'm realizing that it's somebody's first time at the debate, it's somebody's first time watching the show, so I try hard and fail on occasion to do better. It's not as hard as it sounds. If you just think about it and go, what's my goal? Is my goal to be the best representative of my positions I can be? Then if you can't calm down with that as the forethought of your mind, you shouldn't be doing this. That doesn't mean you're always going to get it right, and it's not always a problem. Sometimes you can say, I didn't mean to laugh at you, it was an involuntary reflex, I wasn't laughing so much at you as the position. There's ways to do damage control and show the person that you're talking to that you actually do care about what they're saying, but we're all going to get laughter happens because of surprise. It's almost involuntary, and sometimes it's really hard to fight back. What I should have done as the moderator at that point, and I did not do, was I should have said, hang on a minute, Dr. Price has already said previously that he doesn't believe that any of the writings of Paul were attributed to Paul. Let's let him finish his answer. And that doesn't chastise Bart for laughing, and it doesn't get us to the point where Bob sets down his mic. The problem here is Price also represented that he believes all the Gospels were written in the 2nd century. So that is in opposition to most of modern scholarship. That none of the writings attributed to Paul were Paul's. That's in conflict with modern scholarship. And he has some significant disagreements about how particular passages should be interpreted that flies in the face of what is accepted as the norm in scholarship. And all of that together set up a scenario where it seemed to someone who already believes all this, whether it's an atheist agnostic scholar like Bart Ehrman or the Christians who were sitting in their audience, that this guy's just denying everything. This isn't skepticism, this is denialism, it's cynicism. You're just cherry picking and going with your own personal interpretations, and anything that doesn't fit your goal you're throwing out. And Bart Ehrman had actually accused mythicists of this. And it may or may not be true. But if you're going to say multiple things in a debate and not actually back them up, I understand there's time constraints in a debate. Nobody knows about, hey, your talking time is over more than I do, because I don't ever shut up. And so when the clock hits, I'm mostly surprised, even though I try to do better at it. So in all of this, there was 4 10-minute sections of Q&A where Dr. Ehrman would ask Dr. Price questions for 10 minutes, and then it would flip, and then flip again, and flip again. After 8 minutes or 7 minutes of Bob Price's first question period, he just stopped and said, I don't have any more questions. So he gave up the last 3 minutes of his time for that section. Don't ever do that. I mean, if you find yourself in a formal debate and you're in a question period or you're on the spot and you've got quite a bit of time left, the time belongs to you. Yes, you're supposed to be asking a question and getting answers, but if you can't, then you can at least clarify something that you think may not have come off clearly to everybody, and then say, what did you think of that? There's a question there somewhere. And it got worse because in his second 10-minute questioning period, he sacrificed the last 8.5 minutes. So he really, at this point, he just didn't seem that interested in engaging with his opponent. Whether that's true or not, that's the impression that it gave, so we moved on to the audience questions. Now, I encourage you all to watch the debate and make up your own mind about this. I left the debate leaning even more towards the historicity issue, but I'm not, oh my God, mythicists are stupid and all things, and I can't do that. I started off the Q&A period, but yet watch the debate, because it's the only time this has happened. Bart Ehrman refuses to debate this, and I can almost guarantee you he'll never do it again. Not that it was awful, it wasn't. It was actually good. There were problems with it, but he has no interest in this, and this came up during the debate in discussions. Is this debate even worth having? No. And he's honest about that, but it shocked some people. So while we were waiting for people to line up, I started off the Q&A period by asking them each a question that got to the heart of what I wanted to know. And so I asked Dr. Price, mythicist positions aren't considered respectable in modern scholarship. Why is that? Or why do you think that's the case? And from Dr. Ehrman, my question was, what would it take to make the claims of mythicists worthy of scholarly consideration? Not what would change your mind about the issue, but what would change your mind about whether this is a topic deserving of discussion in scholarly circles? Now, Dr. Price's answer was, well, basically there's this club of the scholars who are respected, and if you're not a part of that club, they're not going to take anything you say seriously. Which sounds like the same conspiracy crap that we hear from the creationists who say, oh, there's a conspiracy amongst the evolutionary biologists to just never take anything the creationists say seriously. It's not necessarily true. But what answer did Dr. Ehrman give? He said, well, they'll need to get some credentials and start teaching and start publishing and earn the respect, and then probably people will change the way they look at their models or theories or whatever word he used. Now, we moved on to audience questions then, but I talked to Dr. Ehrman at the after party because I hate that answer. There's only one right answer to that question in my mind, and that is the mythicists need to do a better job of presenting evidence to support their claim. And when that happens, it will be taken more seriously automatically, because we should be evidence-driven, we should be data-driven. Instead, he gave the answer that it was about the mythicists themselves aren't sufficiently respected or credentialed, which directly confirmed what Bob Price said was going on. And when I talked to him afterwards, I was like, this is the only answer that should ever be given. Here's the evidence, and it's getting better. And instead, you said the people needed to get better credentials and publish and do stuff that was respectable, and then we'll take their ideas seriously. I was focused on what is it about the ideas, and you were focused, what is it about the people? How many think he agreed with me? You're wrong. I appreciate your optimism. But he actually reasserted his same position that, no, what needs to happen is this, and this is the way scholarship is done, and you're not going to be respected, and your ideas aren't going to be respected. And if that's the case, then we have a big frickin' problem with modern scholarship. Because I got no credentials. None. And I'm fine with that. But what I say is true or not true, independent of any credential I have. Now, I can understand it might be more difficult for me to get my foot in the door to get my ideas considered if they don't have any reason to respect me. And mythicists is certainly a mostly unknown fringe position, but it's not so fringe that the scholars aren't aware of it, and this is evidenced by the fact that they kept refusing to debate and then finally showed up to do a debate. And they've all published, well, some of them have published books on why Jesus is real in response to the mythicists. So you can't pretend like this is not actually worthy of discussion at all and write a book to point out how the other side's wrong and then write off their position based on respect and not based on the evidence and data. Historical methods that historians use have been challenged by mythicists and others. And it kind of works like this. If somebody is presented as having been real by a claimed contemporary, hey, my cousin Joe, as soon as I say that, you all assume I have a cousin Joe. I don't. Actually, I do. Shit. If I didn't, though, but that's the assumption we make, and we do the same assumption in history. If somebody is represented as a real figure, then we just take it as the fact that that's the case, because most of the time we're right to do so. Most of the time people aren't running around making up people. Sometimes they do. And so we're going to err on the side of caution, and also most of the time it doesn't matter whether that person actually existed or not. Sometimes in the mythicist discussions you'll say, well, did Plato exist? Did Socrates exist? I don't know. I don't care. Because what they said is either right or wrong, independent of if they were real or if it was somebody ghostwriting and pretending to be them. The truth of their existence has no bearing on what they've said. But that's not true with someone like Jesus. If you could demonstrate that Jesus never existed, it should be the death knell of Christianity. It won't be. But it should be, because there's no there anymore. I think they'll find a way around it, but I'll talk more about that in a little while. So I had a list of questions that I was going to ask, but it turns out the moderator really doesn't get to ask questions. I should have known that. I did cheat and get the one in while everybody was lining up. But there were questions I wanted to ask about this. One of them was, if we assume that Jesus is historical based on the text, what other parts of the text should we also accept? Where do we draw the line between the mythical facts about this? Because we all agree, even Ehrman agrees, there are mythical claims about Jesus, whether he existed or not. Where do you draw the line, and why? How do you make that determination? If, Elvis sightings left and right, we just kind of write them off. Why do we draw that line? And what historical method do we have to say, we have good reason to think he existed, but no, he didn't walk on water or turn, 5 loaves and fishes into feeding the masses, etc. The one question I was getting to is, I know Ehrman rejects miracles, as does every secular person I actually interact with. So when we have a reported miracle, what can we determine from that? Did something happen, but we can't confirm it was a miracle? Did something other than what was described happen and it blew up and got, like JT did a magic trick earlier, I dabble. One of my favorite things is that if I do a magic trick, I like listening to how people describe it afterwards, because what they describe is not only better than what I did, it's better than what I could have done. We exaggerate. We have this tendency to do it all the time. So how do we figure out which part of the story is exaggeration? Yes, secularists, recognizing that we don't have a path to confirm the supernatural, immediately dismiss all the claims of anything that's supernatural. But, if I spit on some mud and put it on somebody's eye and they start seeing again, what if something kind of like that happened? Instead of presuming it's a miracle, maybe there was some healing property there. Maybe it was a cataract and it got scraped out. Who knows? Where do we draw the lines? And I wanted that answered, and we didn't quite get there. You'll often hear from mythicists that Paul never views Jesus as if he's a real physical being. All of the things that Paul describes about Jesus' death and resurrection, it all happened in some celestial realm. They're hearkening back to Gnostic ideas about celestial wars. And I wanted to know, is that true? What are the arguments for, did Paul actually believe that Jesus was a real physical person? Because when I read it, it never occurred to me that he was talking about anything other than a physical person. And when he goes to meet the apostles, they all represent Jesus as a real person who was crucified by the state at the behest of the Jews. And so if they're making this representation and Paul goes and talks to them, and Paul thinks that Jesus is some, sky god thing in a battle in, outer space, surely they would have discussed this. They posted their other disagreements. They had knockdown, drag-out fights over circumcision and whatever else. They don't seem to have mentioned this disagreement at all. So aren't we in good standing to err on the side of, hey, they probably had the same idea about whether or not this person was real? Or have I made a mistake? The weird thing about this debate is that Bart Ehrman doesn't think that Jesus was does think that Jesus was a historical figure, but never represented himself as divine. Not that the Bible doesn't represent him as divine, but Jesus' words never represent him as divine, is Bart's position. Dr. Price doesn't think that Jesus was a historical figure, but thinks the fictional figure definitely did represent himself as divine. Although he understands that there are arguments in the other direction. If we can't even agree on the divinity claim, or what was actually said, or what was actually done, what hope do we have of getting to the heart of whether or not this was a real person? There's a distinction between the red letter Jesus word claims of divinity and the apostle gospel claims of divinity. And mythicists will often, some people will say Jesus never claimed to be divine. I perhaps disagree, but there's no denying that the Bible, I don't think there's any denying that the Bible represents Jesus as divine. After all, what was he killed for? And the message is, if you've seen the Father, you've seen me. I and the Father are one. Before Abraham was, I am. All of these things are basically putting himself co-equal with God, which is why we end up with a heretical pronouncement that he needs to be killed. Problem here is that we have no path to confirm the supernatural. There's no method by which we can verify the supernatural exists, find out what it is, can it interact with reality, so we're stuck. We can't do any of that. But we should have a way to figure out whether or not somebody existed. Problem is, we don't have a time machine. And sometimes when we're trying to find the answer to something, the only thing that will appeal is absolute certainty. Well, I don't see any path to absolute certainty on anything ever. And so if your position is not going to be changed unless somebody can prove to absolute certainty that you're wrong, you're never going to change your mind. You just can't get there. The number of scholars that are engaged in these things, or there are a number of scholars who are engaged in them, most of the New Testament experts are Christians. All right, most of the credentialed teaching New Testament experts are Christians. Quite a lot of them are atheists. We're just not teaching. Or not teaching in a credentialed environment. If they're willing to accept the supernatural, and they have some invested interest in Jesus existing, how likely are they to ever consider the possibility that they might be wrong? So when we talk about what the general view of scholarship is, maybe, just for a moment, we remove all the Christian scholars in this area and look at only the ones that are non-believers and say what percentage of the non-believing scholars accept a mythicist idea of some variety. And if it turns out that the majority of those also reject mythicism, which I think may well be the case, then mythicism is kind of stuck on hold as legitimately not part of scholarship, even if we remove the potential bias of people who have a reason to believe this. But some mythicists will do the same thing in the other direction. If we're going to talk about bias, there are people who very clearly would love to show that Jesus never existed. It's awesome. Their goal is to put it into Christianity for whatever reason. They're convinced it's not true. And so that's why you get discussions of Christianity being invented by the Pope and the Masons in the 4th century. And hey, look, we found another book that we can't authenticate and don't know where it comes, but it says, literally, we made up Jesus. I mean, there's Joseph Atwill, I think, comes up with one of these every couple of years, or at least they're reprinting the same one over and over again. So there is a tendency among some mythicists to go too far that direction. And we're never in a position where we can say, oh, the truth lies in the middle. You can't say that until you know where the truth is. All right, we're under attack. There were other questions about translation accuracies, about, which version of the Bible should we be reading if we want to try to assess this stuff. How many degrees do I have to be able to do that? Dan Barker pointed out there that, why are the Gideons putting Bibles in hotel rooms if you need to have a whole bunch of education in order to actually understand what that book says. Aren't they doing a disservice to people? Yes, that Bible's dangerous when you hand it to common folk. You can't do that. It's like handing a child a loaded gun. We have no autographs, no originals. There's mixed traditions and scribularies and interpolations and all this stuff. Yes, I'm not a mythicist, and I'm slightly more in the vein of historicity, but let me tell you why I don't care. I do not care about this issue in anything other than an academic curiosity. I went because I wanted to see this debate, because I wanted to see it discussed, to see if it could change this position of mine. Not if it could move me to be convinced that, yep, we're reasonably certain or reasonably confident that Jesus existed, or we're reasonably confident he didn't. But could it change my mind on whether or not I give a damn about this issue? And the answer is no. We can concede things without running into a problem, not just for the sake of debate, not just to set up a reductio ad absurdum counter to something. I can say, okay, I'm willing to accept that there was probably an itinerant Jewish preacher named Yeshua, and maybe some of these stories point to him, but I don't know that I have a good, accurate record of his words and deeds, so you now need to demonstrate to me that we have an accurate record of his words and deeds before we can get any closer to whether or not he was divine. Can you do that? No. The lack of originals, we don't know how accurate it is. But you know what? I could go a step further. I could concede that Jesus existed, and I could concede that we have an accurate record of his words. What about his deeds? What if I also concede that we have an accurate record of his deeds as well? Oh, now you're on to miracles. He turned water into wine. Well, I think that if we're going to say that we have an accurate representation of his deeds, that what we would say is he apparently turned water into wine. I've seen Barry and Stewart do that. I can do it. Not here right now, but, some way. But the thing is, you can't say, oh, he raised Lazarus from the dead. That was a deed of his. Surely this proves that he's God and has magical powers. No. Because we have no access to confirm supernatural causation. You don't get to claim something as a miracle. And as Bart Ehrman has pointed out before, you certainly can't do it from historian methods. Because a miracle is by definition the least probable explanation, and there's no way any competent historian could say that the least probable explanation is the best one. It's been confirmed. We just can't do that. All we have to, the closest we get is something happened, we've got a record of it, don't know how he did it. Which is how you walk out of half of the magic shows you go to. Now, I'm not arguing for the Jesus was a magician thing. I'm just pointing out that Jesus as a magician is certainly more plausible than Jesus as the divine being who has these powers. The fact that there's any legitimate question, no matter how much modern scholars want to write off mythicists, the fact that there's even the opportunity for reasonable people to say, hang on a second, maybe this guy didn't exist, or maybe we don't have an accurate record of what he did. That is also something that should be the death knell of Christianity, and it's not. We're unlikely to ever find sufficient evidence to prove Jesus didn't exist, he was invented. No matter how much people try or forge it or claim it, we're unlikely to get there. And until it's virtually certain that he didn't exist, this won't have any serious impact on Christianity. And maybe even if it becomes virtually certain he didn't exist, it still might not have any significant impact on Christianity, because people already believe. Some people are not going to give that up. Some people will tell you, there's no way you can change my mind on this. I know God. God is real to me, interacts with my life. There's nothing you could say or do that could show that God didn't, find my car keys, or whatever it was that ultimately convinced them. So all the time that we spend on this isn't a waste. It may turn out to ultimately be a waste if we never get to the point where we find something that can compel reasonable people to perhaps reject it. But there are so many bigger issues with theism, with Christianity, with Islam, with Scientology. I know that they don't actually have a Jesus, but I'm going down the line of religion saying there are real problems. And if we're in a position right now where people claiming that Jesus didn't exist, whether they are right or not, are looked at as fringe conspiracy theorists, and they don't have sufficient evidence to even convince other secular scholars, then this will not have any impact on Christianity until that changes. It's far better to say that you're uncertain on the issue, because that's damning too. How could you not be incredibly confident about this? They certainly are. I mean, after all, they're all the time claiming to detect the undetectable. Oh, God works in mysterious ways. We don't know how he does it. He doesn't interact. He exists outside of space and time. You can't really detect him, but I know that he answered this prayer. Congratulations, you're a God detector. It's far better to say you're uncertain on the issue, but that you're willing to accept that Jesus existed, and then the words and deeds and blah, 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 without ever having to accept that he was divine or worked miracles, because we have no ability to confirm the existence of the supernatural. This is the key thing. This is the thing that underscores most of religion, is that people are convinced they have access to the supernatural. So keep putting that to the test. How did you make that determination? Hey, I had a headache and I prayed and it went away. Headaches go away. When you grow a limb back, we can start on a slightly different test path here. Oh, I know that the Lord told me to do this. Cool. Did you hear an audible voice or was it just in your head? Because we've got both. All right. Now, whichever one it was, how do you know that was the Lord? How do you know you weren't being deceived? How do you know it wasn't an auditory hallucination? How do you know it wasn't something going wrong in your brain? We know things go wrong in people's brain all the time. Do you have any independent way to verify this? And even at the end of the day, if you're convinced, is there any reason that I should be convinced because you are? Your personal experience shouldn't convince me at all on issues like this. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We hear that all the time. You've got an extraordinary claim. You may, in fact, have good reason to believe that it's true, but I can never have good reason to believe it's true just because you told me you have good reason. You can believe anything that way. This is where we get to faith. Name any position that could not be justified by appealing to faith or saying, I had a personal experience I can't demonstrate to you. Ta-da! Everything can be justified that way. If Jesus existed, you could still reach the conclusion that he wasn't divine. And if Jesus didn't exist, well, he definitely wasn't divine. But we're not there yet. And as long as mythicists are claiming personal interpretations, personal dates, disagreeing with scholarship on the dating of Gospels or who wrote what or what the correct interpretation of a passage is, appealing to astrotheology analogies that don't actually get you to facts about the situation, but certainly feel good. Like if anybody's seen Zeitgeist and the first time you watch it, you're like, holy crap, the sun goes up and it's there for 3 days and it's like, ah, yeah, and then you buy into this and then you dig below it a little bit later and you're like, okay, I mean, there may be elements of that. Oh, but he had 12 disciples and there's 12 astrological symbols. It's like, yes, lots of 12s. Lots of 3s. I did a video on 3 as a magic number. I won't go through the whole thing now because you guys are tired. I'm almost done. But if you start looking for something and you have a goal of finding that something, you're going to find a way to find it quite often. And we keep fooling ourselves. But until the foundations of mythicism change, and there are people who are trying to do it, Dr. Carrier has written a book on using Bayes' theorem for proving history, and has used Bayes' theorem to demonstrate to a high probability that Jesus never existed. But I'll echo Bart Ehrman's sentiments because I share them. Swinburne has used Bayes' theorem to demonstrate that Jesus was almost certainly divine. So if your method, used by 2 different people, end up with 2 competing results, then maybe that method doesn't apply or it hasn't been honed enough yet to be a useful tool for that. Until this changes, and I don't say this to be mean to my friends who are mythicists, mythicism is not ready for the big time. And the answer that I wish Bart Ehrman would have given is, when you come with good arguments and evidence to back them up, that's the time at which we'll take mythicism seriously. We're not shutting you down. I'm open having my mind changed on any number of things. I have a number of friends, good friends, who are mythicists to varying degrees. but it's not ready for big leagues. And I think that I would never say that a debate, even on a topic like this or whatever you want to pick, is necessarily a waste of time. Because everybody can learn something from it. If you can't learn something from finding out something's wrong or not ready yet, there's a mistake. Hey, we're mythicists, and we had this debate, and it seems like it might have been a waste of time. I'm sorry it was a waste of time for you, but it wasn't a waste of time for me. It wasn't a waste of time for the mythicists who may not have felt that their position was fairly represented, because now they go back to the library and they do some studying and they say, figure out, what did we do wrong? How can we make this better? Maybe they never get there. Maybe we're never going to find a cure for cancer. Doesn't mean we should stop looking. There may come a time where the position is so demolished and outlandish that we stop trying. I don't think we're there yet. But I also don't think it's necessarily something that should be a part of modern scholarship. And while I lean slightly toward the historicity side after the debate, who knows? In a number of years, with the right evidence, and I don't give a damn about the credentials of the person presenting the evidence, maybe I'll sway the other way. But it's not there yet. Thanks.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.